Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Very happy to be here. Hope you're having a good tech barbecue so far. My name is Bijal Nagrashna. I am the Startup Business Development Manager for AWS, and I work with startups in the Nordics and Baltics. I work with startups that are two-person team all the way to bigger companies, such as Vivino here in Denmark. My team also worked for other companies like Lyft and Airbnb. And how do we do this? We actually partner with incubators and accelerators from all over the world and try to help their startups. So a little bit about me and my background, why I'm here to tell you how to scale your DNA. There you go. So I've been at Amazon for about 5 years now, and I help companies go global, both on the technology and on the business side as well. And to give you a little bit of background, I went to engineering school, had to learn the code, was in consulting, investment banking, mergers and acquisitions. And throughout that process, I always introduced some technology to kind of get things moving a little faster, try things out. And it was very slow to take on. They were quite excited, but there was a lot of risk into doing things when you're an investment manager, for example, and you have to do the same thing over and over again. So I left, and I joined a startup that was acquired. And then I started my own company, and then I co-founded another company as well. And I loved being in an environment where I could try things that I could innovate and iterate. And throughout that process, I was also recruited by Amazon, and I actually didn't want to work for a big company. I thought it would be really slow, and things would kind of get bogged down. But as you know, building a company, there are lots of ups and lots of downs, and I was a bit burnt out. So I thought, I'll just work for the company for 1 year, and then I'll do startups again after that. But I got tricked into staying 4 more years, and I'll tell you the story about that in a little bit. So how many of you are familiar with the Dunbar Number, or the rule of 150? So 150 is a number of individuals that a person can actually maintain a stable relationship with. And beyond that number, you actually need to create rules and mechanisms. So I'm here to talk to you about how to scale your company, going from a team of 2 to 15 to 150, beyond 1,000 and whatnot. So many of you may know Steve Blank, the father of Lean Startup. He talks about the customer development process. And in that, he says a lot of companies focus on the search phase, which is customer discovery and customer validation. You're probably building an MVP at this moment or doing some iteration or whatnot. And less focus is spent on the execution phase of this process, which is customer creation and company building. And he says very little attention is paid in company building. And when he talks about company building, he actually refers to it as a Shakespearean tragedy, meaning after spending blood, sweat, and tears, your company may fall apart. Your investors may push you out, maybe your co-founders are not seeing eye to eye on a strategy, or your engineering team may not be working cohesively. What made you excited at the very beginning may not be the same thing that's going to take your company to the next phase. And yet, we have seen a lot of founders that are able to successfully transition their company even post-IPO, and even stepping away as a CEO to let the company run. Successful transition with the company at constant and rapid execution. Now, how do they do this? I'll share with you a few case studies of some of our customers. So Airbnb is a long-time customer of ours. And they're very open to culture and how they handle culture within the company. So when Airbnb received their Series C funding from Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, Brian, the CEO of Airbnb, invited Peter to Berlin to talk about various metrics and the strategy behind the company. And he asked Peter this one question. It's like, what is the one piece of advice that you can give us? And Peter turned to him and answered, don't mess up the culture. He says that when a company gets the size of Airbnb when they were at Series C, a lot of times they just mess things up and do not look into company building. And one of the reasons he gave $150 million to Airbnb was because of their culture. So this got Brian thinking, and he wrote a blog post called Don't Fuck Up the Culture, which I encourage you to read. In that blog post, he says, the culture is what creates the foundation for all future innovation. If you break the culture, you break the machine that creates your product. Now, how are they set up from a practical standpoint? Airbnb has teams of 5 or less. They're very cross-functional. They have engineers, developers, product managers, data scientists, and whatnot. They have a host team and also a guest team because the needs are a bit different. But because of the symbiotic relationship of those two, they're encouraged to collaborate on goals, on product roadmap, and whatnot. Now, what is your startup DNA? A lot of companies, when they're small, they're very agile. They're able to deliver innovation at a very fast rate. But then you get big, and you may get bogged down into the details, and it may get bureaucratic. When is the role of culture important? Well, it's when you start your company. At Amazon, we actually have a saying that every day is day one, which means we always anticipate things, and we think like a startup from day one. Now, what are some of the things that you should do when you're creating your company? Well, the first few hires are very important to a founder because it sets the scene of the environment that you're going to have. If you hire mediocre or unmotivated employees at the very beginning, it could spell doom. In fact, Airbnb created their values before they made any hires. Brian Chesky, the CEO, actually said in the first 300 hires, because he wanted to make sure that the DNA of the company was instilled in those first 300, because he knew that they were going to make decisions of the other hires and also the roadmap. Now, one of the things that I do is I also go to incubators and accelerators and mentor startups. So some of the things that we work on is obviously the investor pitch deck. How do you present yourself to an investor? How do you illustrate the value proposition to potential customers? But we see very little time is being spent on the employee pitch deck. What are your values? What kind of people is it that you want to hire? And Jeff has something to say about that.
You attract people who have the DNA of pioneers and the DNA of explorers. You build a company of like-minded people who want to invent. And that's what they think about when they get up in the morning. How are we going to work backwards from customers and build a great service or a great product?
So to attract the right people, how do you clearly articulate your values? Glassdoor did a study that companies that spend time on employer branding are actually 3 times as likely to hire the right people. So what happens when you're scaling and trying to get to that next stage? How do you turn your culture into a place where people can be successful? So the VP of engineering at Airbnb says this: good culture creates an environment where people can do their best work. So what should you think about when you're early stage? Well, think about your identity. Define who you are. And at the next stage, build a structure with your culture, place some structure into that and mechanisms to allow people to be successful. One of our other companies, Supercell out of Finland, they have 4 games, 200 people, and $2 billion in revenue. You may know Clash of Clans. They're actually organized in a cell structure, so it's very bottoms up. So the 4 games have a dedicated games team, and they actually decide the direction of how the game is developed. And the executives at the bottom act as resources and services to the team. In fact, they actually look at failure in a very different way. They throw champagne parties when they're failing, and they actually name conference rooms after failed games. And they take all the learnings into their game development in the next phase. Another one of our startups, so you may know them, Mapillary, out of Malmo. Mapillary is a street-level imagery platform that automates and scales mapping. And what's really interesting about them is that they're a fully distributed team. So the story behind this is I was actually hosted a CTO lunch a few months ago for about 25 CTOs. And we went around and asked about pain points. And I thought their problems were going to be very technical, but it was quite interesting. Every one of them said that they wanted to know how to create better teams, how to get the engineering teams working together, how can they grow and scale and take the team to the next phase. And I was sitting next to Peter, the CTO of Mapillary, and he told me that when we were a team of 10, the CEO made them define their values. And he was thinking, why am I doing this right now? But then he said, now that we're 53, I'm so happy we did this because we have 0 hiring issues. So this is what their office looks like. They're fully distributed. 53 people in 14 locations in 8 different time zones. And they use a whole slew of technology to bring the team together. But they're very honest about it. They say it's really not for everyone. But because they clearly define their values, they were able to attract those types of people. So what do they believe in? Well, it also translates into the company, but also into their technology, transparency, collaboration, trust, and obviously they believe in technology because they're building it and they're using it to bring the team together. On a practical standpoint, what do? They communicate a lot. Online, they do a lot of documentation. Everyone has a lot of autonomy and responsibility to carry out their clear goals. They hire the right people. The VP of Data Analytics told me that she actually looks for a twinkle in someone's eyes when they talk about the product and the team. They have flexible work hours, and they don't forget to have fun, both online and offline. And because of this, they have a 96% retention rate. Since the inception of the company, only 2 people have left so far. Now, what happens when you're growing up? At scale, it's a very different story. And Amazon still consider themselves a very tech-driven company even after 24 years. So what is our startup DNA and what brings us together? Well, we call them our leadership principles, and we have about 14 of them. You can look them up. There's definitions for each one of them online. So if I'm in the Tokyo office, if I'm in Copenhagen, Cape Town, or Seattle, I see these leadership principles plastered onto our wall. It's an authentic representation of who we are. It's a practical reference that also helps us in terms of trade-offs, prioritization, strategy development, and also hiring. So going back to the story of how I got tricked into staying 4 more years. So I interviewed at the company, and I thought, again, I'll do this for 1 year and then create my own companies. I was told to make sure I learn about the leadership principles and whatnot, and I thought I'll probably have to know this for 1 week, just like you do like mission statements and visions and whatnot. But when I started working at the company, I realized I was actively encouraged to disagree and commit with leadership as long as I backed it up with data and I was customer obsessed. In fact, everyone at the company is trained to hire. And 90% of the questions that we ask are based on these leadership principles. I realized that these principles were not only something I did personally, but also professionally when I built my own companies. And the team that I was interviewing with also wanted to make sure that I exude some of these principles because they wanted to make sure that they hired the right person for their culture. If I missed some of my goals, for example, but I exemplified most of these leadership principles, I would still be a valuable employee at the company. This is how important our culture is at Amazon. So I'm going to dive deep in a couple of our leadership principles to give you a little bit of idea of how we work and how we're structured together. So the first one is called ownership. Leaders are owners. They think long-term and don't sacrifice short-term value for short-term results. They act on the behalf of the entire company beyond just their own team. And they never say, that's not my job. At the company, leaders are not just executives. Every one of us are leaders. So for example, I'm seen as a leader for Nordic startups. And this also is very applicable to how we operate and do our development as well. We're set up in more of a DevOps model. We've been doing this since early 2000. We actually internally call them 2 pizza teams. So we say that if a team is too big and we can't feed them with 2 American-sized pizzas, then it gets a little too big, it gets too bogged down in details. So we break it up and make the team a little smaller. So it's similar to the whole Airbnb model that I talked about of 10 teams or less. And obviously the teams are cross-functional. You have designers, developers, and whatnot. And that team is in charge of seeing everything through the life cycle. So instead of writing up code and sending it to somewhere else, we actually own everything from beginning to end. So right now, if you launch Amazon, you're invoking 250 features and services. Each one of these services has a 2-pizza team that works on that particular feature. The next one is dive deep. Leaders operate at all levels. They stay connected to the details and audit frequently. No task is beneath them. So we not only have to take a 50,000-meter view, but we also have to get down to the details, roll up our sleeves. And the way we do this is that we're a very data-driven company. So each of the 2 pizza teams that I talked about earlier, they have a scorecard. So they look at metrics on a weekly basis. So for example, I'm thinking about piloting a program in Denmark. And if it's going quite well, I get nice results. I look at the data, everything is great. Maybe I scale it out to the Nordics or to the rest of Europe. Alternatively, I can take a look at the data and mitigate risk as well. If I see something isn't going right in the data, I dive deep and I try to fix it. An example of this, Amazon Instant Video. A few years ago, when customers sat down on their couch all comfy to watch a movie, the movie all of a sudden would stop. and would start all over again. It's not really a great customer experience. So someone on this two-pizza team noticed this in the data. So they dove deep into the data and found out what was happening. So what this person did on the two-pizza team is that they proactively sent an email to all the customers that were affected, apologizing and refunding their money. So this person not only dove deep into the data, but they were also customer obsessed by being proactive and giving out a refund. The last one I'd like to talk about is customer obsession. Leaders start with the customers and work backwards. They work vigorously to earn and keep customers' trust. All the leaders pay attention to the competitors, they obsess over customers. When Jeff Bezos started Amazon, he wanted to create the world's most customer-obsessed company. And this really pushes a lot of what we do in terms of product innovation. So one of the mechanisms that we have put in place is called the working backwards method. What we do is anyone in the company that has an idea can create this document called a press release. And what this does is that we envision what the product or service would look like 6 months from now. So we pretend to write a press release, let's say to the Wall Street Journal. We talk about the product, how much it is, maybe what color it is, have quotes from our customers and whatnot. And we gather everybody in a meeting, all the stakeholders. We sit and read it for about 15, 20 minutes. If it doesn't evoke any questions or any emotions, that we don't write a single line of code. But when we start answering questions, we start developing the FAQ. So we put ourselves in our customer's shoes and think about what questions they may ask. Is it available in Japan? Can I get it extra large? And we compile this in a document as well. So here's an example from 2007 of when we were discussing the Kindle. So we talk about the Kindle, how much it is. You can download books and blogs and magazines. Very innovative. It's $3.99. We have a website of where you could potentially buy it, and also a quote from Jeff Bezos. Once you get internal buy-in, whether it's for headcount or for budget or just strategy buy-in, we start building our MVPs. So in the case of AWS, the EC2 API that we had is actually the primitive for our EC2 compute services. And what's very important is also our rate of iterating and also experimentation. And Jeff has something to say about that.
But successful invention, if you want to do a lot of that, you basically have to increase your rate of experimentation. And that you can think of as a process. How do you go about organizing your systems, your people, all of your assets, your own daily life and how you spend time? How do you organize those things to increase your rate of experimentation?
So we did this in our architecture as well. We started off as a monolithic application. Many of you may have done that as well, creating a web app or whatnot. But when you start scaling, you can't innovate on features fast enough. You may have a lot of dependencies or even regression testing. This is a map of all of our microservices when you launch Amazon.com. It's very API-driven. Every function and feature is developed into its own. And you can think of it as all these little dots being their own two pizza teams that own everything from beginning to end. Now, if you think of rate of experimentation as how many trials and tests you run in production. So at Amazon, the speed of deployment is actually very fast. These are numbers that I'm allowed to share with you. From 1 month, we were able to push into production every 11.6 seconds. Some companies spend 3 or 6 months to do that. And it's not to a small subset. We do it to 10,000 or even 30,000 instances. And it's a good example of how we can rapidly experiment and push things out as well. And it's also an example of all the components of our culture being brought together. So I discussed the architecture going from monolithic to microservices, also mechanisms working backwards, the press release and the FAQ. The culture, our people, our leadership principles, and also how we hire, and also how we're organized for experimentation with our two pizza teams. So we also talked about Airbnb, the team of 10 or less, Supercell with their bottom-up structure, and Mapillary being fully distributed. What is it that you should think about? Well, think about who you are, what behaviors you'd like to exude, what types of people that you would like to hire, and what your values are. And when you start growing and scaling, think about mechanisms and organization structure that you can put in place in order to enable innovation and experimentation at scale. Thank you.